Scott, we have gone live.
Easy peasy.
And hopefully, link. Would you like the link to make sure audio levels are all good for anybody caring
Up,
to watch?
levels. Yeah. Let's have it.
All right, I think we're actually pretty good, but I will send them to you as well. We can go put this out in Discord. I'm hearing my echo. My echo is gone. Let's go drop this out in Discord for anybody that wants to join us live via our membership. Live on YouTube talking about conditional access. There we go. So we are talking about conditional access today, Scott. Does everything look good, sound good, appear good?
So far, so good.
We're good. All right. So we made it. We tried to do this Tuesday, and Scott had to slap me upside the head and say, stop doing betas of everything.
Indeed.
So,
that is a thing that I did.
Yes, I had some beta issues. So we didn't make it Tuesday, but here we are on Friday, and it's lunchtime, Scott. We're switching up the date of these. I don't remember. Did we do our last one at lunchtime-ish too? Just hopefully.
We did. I look at this as a constraining measure for you and I. Hopefully it gets you to stop playing with betas, but yeah.
I'm going to do my best. You can hold me accountable to stopping to play with betas. So, do you want to just dive right into the documentation? Again, going to time constrained, we both have meetings and other stuff and podcast record and all of that. But we thought
Sure.
Conditional access would be fun today. So let's jump over. You have this documentation.
Back over to Microsoft 365 land. Yep. So let's take a kind of quick look at just what is conditional access and what's going on with it. So Microsoft kind of brought it as you have a set of signals, kind of conditions that you can evaluate or make a decision on top of. And then once you've made that decision, you can take an action. So they kind of talk about that as signal decision enforcement. It's really, to me, kind of condition, decision, action, and what happens within there. But really, what you're able to do is you're able to pick from kind of this canned set of conditions, and those conditions could be things like where is a user located, maybe on like a reverse GeoIP lookup kind of thing. What type of device is a user using? Are they on a mobile device? Are they on Windows? Are they on a Mac? Are they on a device that meets my organization's security requirements, right? Are they on like a BYO thing that's maybe not MDM'd, or using some form of MAM on top of it, or it's not a registered device? Or are they on a registered device? And you know, you want to be able to kind of check and make sure that the device meets your organization's requirements before it's able to access some piece of data within the Microsoft cloud or outside of the Microsoft cloud as well. So it's an authentication kind of checker. So it's not doing an authorization check or anything like that. It's not saying like, hey, in the case of maybe like a SharePoint site, does Ben or Scott have access to that SharePoint site? No, that's SharePoint's job to do. But should Ben or Scott be able to access that SharePoint site based on our organization's security posture is kind of a great question and a great capability that something like conditional access can help us solve. So like I said, there's a number of kind of common conditions or signals that you can go ahead and leverage. GeoIP, reverse IP is a good one. You can even do things like configure trusted locations or named locations. So say your on-premises sites have fixed IP ranges, you can put in those cedar blocks and actually leverage those to say, like, maybe when a user's in the office and they're on our network and on our WAN, don't MFA them. But when they're off it, like if they go across the street to Starbucks, go ahead and MFA them. Like, let's make sure they are who they say they are, kind of thing. You can base those conditions on group membership, or just by virtue of being like the type of user that you happen to be. It could be an application. I think this is where some of this stuff gets really powerful and really interesting. Applications could be something that are intrinsic to Microsoft's portfolio of applications. So I think like M365 offerings, SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, Planner, all those kinds of things, or the Azure portal certainly kind of falls in there. You also have non-Microsoft applications. So there's a whole bunch of applications that support federated identity with Azure Active Directory. And if those applications support federated identity, then cloud's the limit. You can go ahead and do whatever you want to it. So that might be like brokering and authentication to Salesforce. And applying that same set of rules. MFA me when I'm not. Don't MFA me when I'm in the office and I'm going to my Salesforce CRM, but MFA me when I'm out of the office, kind of thing. There's some other stuff in there too. You can do these kind of real-time risk detection features. So, did the user travel further than they were supposed to be in a minimum amount of time? A good maybe kind of use case there is, I normally access all of my stuff from Jacksonville, Florida. But if all of a sudden you see an authentication attempt coming in from China at the same time, or that I'm in Jacksonville, it might not be valid. It very likely is not valid. Or even things like, if I'm in Jacksonville and I hop on a VPN and that VPN takes me over to Seattle or Los Angeles, something like that. Like maybe you don't want to allow those kinds of things to happen. And then you can extend this whole system to Defender for cloud apps as well, kind of the old MCAS, the Cloud App Security Suite, or the artist formerly known as MCAS, I guess, and be able to integrate with that lens and that side of the world as well. So that might be things like even an on-premises application that runs through app proxy. Maybe you're using cloud app security with something like, say, Dropbox, and you're allowing users to share things through Dropbox, and you want to subject Dropbox to a session policy with conditional access on top of it. You can do all those kinds of things. And really what you're doing is you're kind of walking down this path of saying, like, okay, here's a condition. Does the device or user, the thing that they're trying to access from, does it meet this condition? And if so, then what do I want to do with it? Do I want to block access? Do I want to grant access? And if I grant access, do I want to take additional steps on top of that? Like I said, like I think MFA is one of the most kind of common ones that could be in there. You might also want to check for things like device compliance, and get all that along. There are some licensing constraints you should be aware of. Welcome to the world of the whole like P1, P2 for Azure AD thing. And does that come with my version of Microsoft 365, or am I just a straight Azure AD customer? It's potentially on you to go rationalize and figure out. But really, you're looking for basically an Azure AD P1 license or an equivalent coming over from whichever kind of licensing suite that you're in, or you want to buy those P1s on top of it. And then if you want some of the risk-based stuff, you want to be able to get access to additional Azure AD features like sign-in logs, all that kind of stuff, you can go ahead and pick up an Azure AD P2 license. But
Yeah.
I think that's a whirlwind tour of kind of the top end of it. And it starts to make a lot more sense once we kind of pull up the Azure AD portal and start taking a look at it.
Yeah, and I think there was one other thing. It was up higher in the documentation. It was one of the purple notes up there. That it talks about, maybe it was the blue note. That, and I saw someone ask about this once, and it made me think about it, and I wanted to call it out, is that those conditional access policies are enforced after that first form of authentication. So this would be like, if you were thinking about on-premises world, this would be like applied after the firewall or after that initial ingress into your tenant. And
Correct.
someone was asking about, well, why is it there and not on the outside? And reality is it has to know who you are and what tenant you belong to in order to look at those conditional access policies and know what to apply. Because you don't want
Yeah.
someone else's conditional access policy applying to your tenant. You want your tenant access policies and needs to know who you are in order to do that.
Yeah, so this is defense in depth, and it's kind of like defense in depth in practice. So it's not preventing authentication, it's doing additional checks post authentication. So it's part of your authentication pipeline. Like think of it as an extension or a plus one to your existing extension authentication pipeline. It's not doing authorization, like I said, like that's long tail and kind of in the thing that you're actually trying to get into. But yeah, that's why you might want to monitor it. Say for like a user who had some phish credentials. So your user goes through, they're subject to some type of social engineering, and you go, great, their credentials leaked out to somebody in China, and you don't want that to happen. Like you don't do business with anything in China. You just know, like I don't need this to happen. That's not going to stop the person who phished the credentials from getting in, or at least authenticating the first time. What's going to stop them is the additional check to say, is this user coming from a location that I allow? Or if this user is trying to access something that's super important, maybe I should have MFA on top of that. And hopefully that stops that authentication in its tracks, right? Like we just go ahead and we cut that off and we say, okay, let's block it, and you're still good to go. So
Yeah,
yeah, I don't get as hung up on it. Like if you've configured it the right way and it's dialed into where you want it to be, then I think you're in a better place than you would be without it. Like getting hung up and saying, I never want to allow connections from China in the first place. Like I can totally see and kind of be empathetic to that. But at the same time, to I think implement this level of functionality, you kind of do have to be at least a step after saying, did the user put in the right username and password?
exactly. And the other thing, because we talked about the licensing, I would say you get 90% of this with just that P1 license. I tell a lot of people like conditional access for me is like the single biggest reason everybody should go out and get Azure AD P1 at least because
Yeah.
of the amount of things you can do with conditional access with that P1 license and implementing all this additional security, being able to do conditional MFA, limit apps, all of that in my opinion, is worth the Azure AD P1 license alone. Um, that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and if you're a Microsoft 365 customer, like you might actually have a P1 equivalent based on whatever level of licensing that you've already selected.
Yep.
So your mileage might vary there, but it's certainly worth looking into. Like if you're looking at it and you're saying, well, darn, I don't have licensing for this, like because I just never went and bought Azure AD P1. I wouldn't necessarily let that stop you. Like you may in fact have it. It's just bundled into some other thing.
Right. In like that EMS license, enterprise mobility security, like you said, the Microsoft 365, it's just not in those or kind of the original, I guess, the Office 365 plans. Um,
Yes.
there was one comment, one question. This isn't directly tied to conditional access, but someone watching said one question they were asked once was, "What happens if someone tries to brute force your password in Azure AD? Does it lock out your account potentially on premises as well?" Um, that is not specifically conditional access, but yes, you can go in and configure essentially lockout policies in
Mhm.
Azure Active Directory so that after so many failed passwords against Azure Active Directory, it does kind of block your account. You can force a password change. There are additional protections there. I don't actually know, and I don't know, does it have the ability to lock your on-prem account as well?
I haven't looked into it in a little bit. So there is the
I know you can unlock.
there is the ability to monitor for password sprays, and kind of look for those kind of events as they're coming through. I believe if you're doing write back and you're tied into your on-prem Azure AD, there is something that you can potentially do there. I think this is like anything else. Like if you only have one account to get into your environment, um, that might not be the best posture for you to have. Another thing you probably want to go take a look at is things like break glass accounts. So yeah, is there the possibility that in general with conditional access, you could lock yourself out of your tenancy due to an overly aggressive conditional access policy? 100,000 million percent. And as far as I know, no one can help you fix it. Like Microsoft support can't do anything like go in and reset your tenant and get you back to where you wanted to be. So you probably do want to have things like a break glass or what Microsoft today refers to as an emergency access account, so that you do have the ability to get in should things go off the rails. And your emergency access account should still be secured in a manner that makes you feel comfortable, right? Like I'm not saying like
Yep,
go configure a global administrator in the onmicrosoft.com domain and then write down the password and stick it on a sticky note between you and your other admin's desk. Like no, like
right.
you can
Put it
still
under
do
your keyboard.
yeah, you can still do things like TOTP on top of that if you want to, like, and if that's your posture. Use complex passwords, like do all these kinds of things and get them in place.
Yeah.
But I think you do very much want to have that kind of that back door to get into your own environment for you to leverage.
Yep. I have one on mine that is I add it to any global access policy. And we'll see it when we go in and configure these. We'll show you the warning where it actually pops up. I think it's like bright yellow letters or bright red letters that say be careful, don't lock yourself out. Um, so I do. I have a break glass account, like an admin account that I exclude from all my policies. And it is not admin at my tenant. I actually used a random string generator. My username is like a 12 character
Mhm.
random string. And then my password is like a 24, 32 character random password. So yes, it is excluded. That does not have the amount of security on it my normal account does. But it is also going to be very hard for anybody to brute force or guess because there is no common words in it. It is just a bunch of random characters for both the username and for the password. And then I have
Yeah.
it stored in a password vault that is also protected with MFA and all of that. So, absolutely do something along those lines because there have been times where MFA has gone down, or there have been
It
issues
does happen.
where you do want to be able to get in without having anything extra applied to an account.
Yeah. I think like maybe one last thing there is I've seen some customers that do things like they go and configure their custom domain in Azure AD and they think that they'll never use the onmicrosoft.com domain ever again. Like definitely leave yourself one of those break glass accounts in the onmicrosoft.com domain just in case something ever happens with your custom domain that's bound to Azure AD and all those kinds of things. Like you want a way to get into your environment that relies only on Azure AD to get into it, and it's not subject to like a hop through an IDP to go back to like ADFS or Okta or anything like that.
Right. Someone even stealing your top level domainers, weird things like that. I've also heard, since we're kind of on this topic of domains, is a lot of these also require like secondary emails. As a secondary email, I've seen best practice is actually like use a Gmail or an Outlook.com or a Apple dot, it's not Apple.com, whatever Apple's is, me.com. I forgot. No, iCloud.
Me
iCloud.com.
dot iCloud, Mac dot
Yeah, the
me. Yeah.
iCloud. Yeah, one of those. Because those domains, it's actually harder to steal your email address from one of those domains than it is to like steal or spoof your email address to hijack email from a custom domain. Um,
Theoretically.
Theoretically, I will say
Yeah.
yes,
All right.
not guaranteed.
So why don't we get out of
Okay,
documentation and hop over and take a
and
look at
jump
some of
over
this
to a
in
screen
the
and
yeah, and we're gonna take a look at this in the Azure portal. So I think that's another fun thing here is, you know, for those that I think get exposed to it the first time, you go like, oh, I'm a Microsoft 365 customer. Congrats, you're an Azure customer as well because there's this whole Azure AD thing that's sitting over there. So
right.
you can go to like dedicated Azure AD URIs to access Azure AD, or you can just get to it straight through the Azure portal.
Yep. So I've gone through. I tend to when I'm doing this type of stuff, I tend to go to aad.portal.azure.com. It's just a shortcut to a limited view of Azure. Where you get your Azure Active Directory, users, enterprise applications. I suppose I haven't tried this. I bet I can go to Entra too and get to it. Should we try this? Entra again. It just gives you another portal. Get you into Azure Active Directory. I don't actually know. It's probably in here somewhere, but I don't know where it is. Settings, protect and secure. Oh, look at that. Protect and secure. Conditional access. There you go. We can do it through
And then it's
Entra as
just
well.
an embedded view of the portal. Yeah, my preference is like what you said, either go to the AED one, or quite often I'm already working on something in the Azure portal, so I'm going to be hopping around that way
You
anyway.
just
So I'll
go
just go through the
right,
Azure portal. Yep.
jump right into Azure Active Directory. End of the day, it's an Azure Active Directory. Uh, so you can go there. I'm going to go through AAD portal. Just if you go this way, if you're in the portal itself and you go to Azure Active Directory, it's going to be down under security. So, like the last option of manage, security, and then within your security blade, this one right here, Scott, then it shows up over here, right?
Theoretically, if you hit refresh enough times, maybe.
Security. There it goes. And then conditional access. So there are some other things within security that can tie into conditional access. You mentioned like blocking from IP addresses. That's going to be some of this named locations. But for today, let's just start in conditional access. I actually have a bunch that are in my environment already. Um, there's some other settings down here. Again, we're not going to mess with these. Do you want to just go in and create a policy and kind of walk through what
Yeah.
settings are in there?
Yeah. Let's do it step by step.
All right. So the first thing I do, I always just start from a new blank policy. The new policy template. I'm going to show you these before we create a new one, just because this is in preview. It's something they added, but it does make things a lot nicer if you're brand new to this, even just to explore how Microsoft creates some of these. But you can go in and choose, I want a policy, and I want one that's revolving around identities, who I am. I'm Scott, I'm Ben, I'm logging in, or one that revolves around devices. I have a Azure AD join device, those bring your own device scenarios that you talked about. So you can pick a category and next. And then it does have a few of these policies pre-configured where you can just select them, hit next, 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 and set the policy. Do you want it off? Do you want to report on it? Do you want it on? Um, this will walk you through some of them. It also is a lot quicker to set up some of them as you're getting new to it. If you know you want to block legacy authentication, or you know you want to require MFA for all your users, this can be a quick, easy way to get some of those policies stood up, to name them without going through it. Again, I like creating them from scratch. I like to fully understand these policies. While you can use these templates, I also do recommend you do some from scratch. Use those once you understand it, because you really do kind of want to know what's going on in these policies.
Yeah. So two things about the policies there. There's that
Okay.
whole built-in set that you talked about.
Yep.
One thing is that the user who is creating the policy from a template, specifically that create from template functionality, the user who's doing it is by default excluded from the policy. So as the person who's configuring the template, I'm not going to lock myself out by configuring it and doing it that way. And I think in general, like that's a good practice to be in. We actually had some folks call it out in the chat. Like create a bypass group for things like emergency access who you never want to have these policies applied to. So the preview template kind of wizard as you're walking through it automatically applies that exclusion. It's only for the user who configured it. You can go and of course modify that policy afterwards and do whatever you want to after it from there. The other thing about those policies is they also, by default, create themselves in report only mode so that you can go ahead and kind of test and monitor and make sure that that policy is going to apply in the ways that you want it to. Think like the what if engine plus, now it's actually monitoring authentication attempts that are coming through the environment kind of thing before you go and turn that policy on. So if you're creating policies on your own, you probably want to take these same kind of logical defaults and considerations into mind. Like have a user or set of users, preferably like a group, that are going to be excluded from this policy. So you always have a backdoor and a way to get in. And you might not want to turn it on right away, but there is kind of the report only mode that you can leverage as well. Or you can use the kind of what if functionality if you want to do that too.
Yep. And even blank ones too. You can see down at the bottom. Blank ones start in report only. That's kind of the default for any conditional access policy that you're going to create.
Yeah.
Let's not turn it on. It also helps with the whole, oh shoot, I locked myself out type scenario. So the first thing
we,
is
we
give it a
keep
name.
mentioning it like it's happened to us once or twice.
I know somebody that had it happen to them. I do not know all the details, so I'm not going to speculate on everything that happened, but there was somebody I know of that was locked out of their tenant for 90 days. They were able to get back into it through working with Microsoft support. I am not going to promise anything because I don't know how they got back in. If Microsoft support was able to walk them through a way where they were able to recover it themselves, I don't know enough details. But I do know that people that have been locked out before, um, again, they were able to get back in somehow. I don't know how, but Microsoft will tell you they do not have the ability to get you back in once you've locked yourself out. I have also been working
If
on
there's ever a
these.
place you want to be trigger happy, this is it.
Yes, and I have been working on these with people before too, where we have had to fall back to that excluded account because we put some condition in there and it didn't quite behave how we thought it would. And we were getting messages, you can't get into your tenant. You don't meet the right getting messages, you can't get into your tenant. You don't meet the right conditions. And we were like, I don't know how to get them. So we fell back to that right glass account. Um, but let's just do it to the cloud. So name, just give it a name. Who do you want, or what do you want your policy to be named? In theory, you saw mine early. This is going to be something like uh, what it's actually doing. Are you enforcing MFA on certain people? Are you limiting access to SharePoint? Um, what is it that you're doing? And give a good description. Somebody just said good naming convention before you start creating all these policies so that as you start layering them on top of each other, it's easy to immediately see what they do and you don't end up with all these weird names in there. So we have a name in there, users or workloads. This is where you start picking who is this going to apply to. By default, it's going to be users and groups. You have none. You can go select all users, and this is where you get that nice warning. Don't lock yourself out. The policy
Don't do
affects
it.
everyone. We would recommend starting with a small set to verify its behavior. Um, Selected users and groups. This is a nice one too. You can do directory roles. So this is a nice feature of maybe certain admins, global admins, for instance. You want to have a certain conditional access policy on, or people that have the ability to go in and reset passwords or any of those Azure roles. So you mentioned this earlier, Scott. This is in Azure. This can be an Azure thing and also a Microsoft 365 thing. You'll see you have all your like Exchange administrator, your SharePoint administrator roles, all of those. But this also includes all of those different role based access controls, permissions from Azure. So this can work with um, both of those environments.
Yeah. Not to be too snarky, but you could test this with a role that's not used in your environment and will never be used, like the Yammer administrator role.
Exactly. Because who uses Yammer here? Yammer administrator. There you go. I could. Um, this other checkbox, this all guests and external users, is another one I've seen people take advantage of before. If you want to enforce maybe MFA on all of your guest users, you can use this conditional access policy to say any guest that's invited into my environment has to use MFA, or maybe like you had talked about before, Scott, different countries, maybe for I don't know, legal reasons, safety reasons, you don't want guests to access your environment from a country outside of your own. You could go in and apply something to all guests and apply a condition based on country, location, that type of stuff.
Hmm.
Uh, Users and groups, this is very much just go pick a user um, or a security group who you want it to apply to. Uh, Exclude is your tab. So we had talked about doing exclusions. This is where you can go in, pick a user, pick an exclusion, and same type of options. Just gives you the opposite. So include all users, but exclude a specific user. So this is where you would maybe choose your users and groups, choose that uh, global bypass group, choose your break glass account if you do want to exclude a user in there. So once we got users, now we get to pick. Okay, we're going to go ahead and do this. We'll be brave. We're going to do it to all users. I'm not going to turn this on or create it. Uh, Next up is what are these users accessing? Um, are they accessing cloud apps? Oh, was there one more thing I wanted to go back and look here? Users and groups. I forgot to show this. Workload identities. Sorry, reverse, go back. Workload identities, you can actually set this up with service principals now. Selected service principals in your environment, all service principals in your environment. That option, I can't remember. This one was relatively new when I saw this one pop up.
Yeah, I think it's its own service principles to the person who's configuring it, isn't it? So, like an enterprise app is ultimately a service principal anyway. So those have other metadata attributes, like who's the individual who owns them.
This one looks like it's by your org. So here it says owned by your organization. Um,
Oh,
so
that that
all
that, that so that'd be like any enterprise apps.
right. Um, Documentation, conditional access, this preview ads, service principals owned by the organization.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So
any of those
an
enterprise
example
apps.
there would be you'll have a set of kind of pre-configured enterprise apps in every Azure AD, or at least like an M365 bound Azure Active Directory. So SharePoint Online would be an application in your enterprise in your directory, but I would take that to mean you can't configure it against SharePoint Online. But if you had developers working on a custom application, then you could do that against it.
Yeah, and this could go in. I think I saw an example too. If you're using a third party app and you want to make sure that third party app doesn't come from a particular location, again, particular country, um, you could do like all owned service principals and block any service principal, maybe trying to access your environment from some other country if you want to block it out based on country. So there are some options there as well. So back down to the apps now. So user or service principal. Um, what apps, what user actions, what authentication context. So lots of options here is what this policy applies to. Um, the most common one is still the cloud apps. And again, you get a nice warning here, don't lock yourself out, because guess what? The Azure portal is considered a application.
Yes, it
So if you
is.
go in and start blocking certain apps, you can block yourself from the Azure portal, as illustrated by select apps. If I go in and search for Azure in here, it's actually Azure will limit it down even more. Microsoft Azure Management, that is the Azure portal. So you can apply conditional access to the Azure portal. You may have seen all the other things in here: advanced threat protection, um, DevOps, Key Vault, Kubernetes, Azure Media Services. All the different Azure services are in here that you can select, as well as all your typical Microsoft 365 ones you'd think of. Um, Office 365 as a whole. So this is what you can see here: Flow, Forms, Teams, um, SharePoint. And then I think you mentioned this too, Scott, any of your third party apps. If I clear this out, you'll actually see apps that I have trusted in mine. Atlassian, Adobe's in here somewhere. You can go see what types of apps I've tried playing with and connecting to my environment. So if it's federated, if you use Azure Active Directory to log in, you can set conditional access on those applications as well. Just like with the users, you can both include all the apps and then go in and exclude certain apps. User actions is going to be register join devices, register security information for authentication. So a couple different things there with user actions. We're not going to worry about authentication contexts for now. That might be a whole separate video or
Yeah,
stream to go over that.
a little bit of its own thing for sure.
Yep. So right now we're going to say all users, all apps. And this is where it starts getting fun: is what are the conditions? So now I'm saying any of my users that access any of my applications, how do I want to control their access? Do I want to control it based on their risk level? So if a user is accessing any of my applications with a user risk level of medium, I want to go apply certain access controls. These next two sections. Or if they're high, this risk-based and sign-in, these are those two that we mentioned that do require premium access. So this is going to be or P2, Azure AD Premium P2 are going to be these risks: risk level, sign-in risk level. Sign-in risk level, same thing: high, medium, low, no risk. Device platforms. This is what type of device is this going to be? Is it an Android device or iOS? Are you that one user that actually still has a working Windows phone and you want conditional
You just
access
wanna block
policies?
those from your environment.
Right? That's what I'm thinking. Like, if anybody's using a Windows phone, let's just block it so we know who they are and we can tell them to go get a supported current modern phone. Windows, Linux, pretty straightforward here. And again, you do have the include or exclude. So you can set that based on the device platform. Locations, this is that IP address we talked about. I do have some trusted locations set up in my environment. So I have an IP range for where I'm coming from. Um, I don't even remember what's in this IP range, but you can do this based on countries too. So you can go in and configure countries within your trusted locations. So instead of having to know IP addresses, it does allow you to go in and set certain policies just based on at least Microsoft's understanding of what country a particular IP block is coming from.
Yeah, I would be careful with that one. Like IPs do move around, so particularly in like the world we're in now with IPv4 exhaustion. I've seen things in the past. One that comes to mind is it was an Azure thing. There
Okay.
was a there was a block of IPv4 addresses that were allocated to Brazil, Brazil South, and because Brazil South wasn't making use of them, and there's a limited number of those to go around, they were all just brought up and brought into a DC and a region in North America. So all of a sudden, all these reverse IP lookups that we're saying, oh my gosh, this is coming from Brazil, block it. We don't want to allow it because it's outside the US. When in fact, it was legitimate traffic from the US. It was just the provider, in this case, Microsoft, had made the decision. Hey, I want to shift some of this around based on where my platforms and where it's at. So things like IP lookups, like they're nice to have, but they kind of like stop there for me. They're not the end all be all. Like you if you're creating a policy that's only based on a condition for an IP lookup, you probably want more than that just there, unless it's specifically constrained to like something on your WAN, like a private IP address or something, or from a public block that you own that you know of.
Yep. I agree. Those I don't tend to use the country ones. I'm the same way. Like use the IP addresses that are known and configure it for those. Um,
Yeah.
so that's going to be location. Client apps. This is also a nice one. So if you want to apply maybe certain conditions, if they're coming from a browser versus a mobile application or desktop client. Or if you this is how you can go in and start blocking some of those legacy authentications is if it's users, if it's cloud apps, and if they're coming in using one of the legacy authentication clients, IMAP, POP, SMTP, Exchange Active Sync. So just setting a few conditions there around what applications that they may be coming from. And we're going to see down under access controls where you can actually fine tune that even more when you get into mobile applications and browsers. And then filter for devices. This one is another one that's relatively new. It showed up recently being the last several months for me. You used to only be able to set conditions based on Azure AD joined, Azure AD registered, or essentially a device that had neither of these. Microsoft added a whole filter for devices section where instead of just saying whether it's trusted or not, you can build out a whole bunch of different options to include or exclude again. But now you can use various properties from those devices themselves. Whether you want
So
to,
that's interesting. I've
it
never seen this
is
before. It looks a little bit like the dynamic group expressions, and I would be willing to bet it uses the same
the
syntax
same
as what it does
language,
for yeah, for dynamic groups. So that those that kind of set a JSON that pushes things through.
right? Very much so. So, like, maybe you're an enterprise that only buys HP devices or Microsoft Surface devices, and you want to go in and set a certain device brand.
It is it is the same expression language. Yeah. Well,
Yep.
that's cool. I mean, like you can carry over the knowledge if you've been doing dynamic groups or anything like that.
Right. So this gives you a ton more flexibility than you used to have. And if you still want to do Azure Device Joined, you still have your trust type. So you could do trust type equals, and this is where you can go in if my drop down works, there it goes, and actually choose I want to use devices manufactured by Microsoft that are Azure AD joined, or they're hybrid joined, they're registered. Um, Go in and start selecting those, and like you said, it builds out a nice builds out the syntax down here so you can see this syntax if you want to. If you want to go in and manually write it yourself, you can go in and do that, and it'll tell you as well if it's not complete. I am not going to write it myself. I don't know all the device properties. Um, but yeah, this is a really nice one that I didn't even see any big announcements. It just showed up, and they got rid of the ability to choose just that kind of more binary. Is it Azure AD joined or not? Um,
Very cool.
it is. This is a fun one. I like this one. There's a lot of stuff you can do with it. I think even custom attributes are in there at expression. Or extension attributes. So you got all your extension attributes, operating systems, versions, labels. Um, yeah, so that's a fun one. But be careful with that one too. Make sure devices are manufactured by who you think they're manufactured by.
Yeah.
So those are all those assignments. So this is, and it took me a little while when I was doing this to wrap my head around it. This is saying who gets this policy applied to them: the user, the apps, or the actions that they're taking, and what conditions does that user and that device live under from a joined
Mhm.
perspective, a location, all of that. After you set who does this apply to, you get to go set. I gotta go turn this off. So you get to set what do they actually get to do. Um, the first thing you can do is you can say just block access. So you can create this in a way not all users, all cloud apps under these conditions are allowed to do stuff, but say all users, all cloud apps under this condition are actually blocked from doing anything. Um, so you can end up with some combination too, some block, some grant based on how you want to do it. Then you can go in and set grant. You can just leave this as grant access. Um, None of these options down here underneath grant are required. It can just be cloud apps, these conditions, grant this access. But if you want to do more, require MFA. This is how you can do your conditional based MFA. Certain users, or maybe all your admins, certain administrators, any global admin coming into any of your cloud apps under these conditions, you want to grant access, but you're going to require them to MFA, and maybe you're going to require my browser. I broke my browser. Uh-oh.
Oh, now you've done it.
Yeah, I did. I broke it. Please hold while I log back in. That was kind of bizarre. Access control. There we go. Require MFA, and maybe you want them to have a compliant device, or you want to make sure they're joining from a device that's been joined to your domain. This is where you can go set additional requirements when they grant access. And this can get a little, I always get a little confused. It turns around in my head with conditions versus grant access. Um, Conditions are when it applies, grant access is you're going to grant it, but this is what you're going to require them to do when they get access.
Yeah, condition is what am I gonna check, and access is what am I gonna do?
Yep, exactly. This is where you can also go in and do a little bit more fine grained control. So if you want to require approved client apps, this is not something you necessarily have control over. But you can go in and here are all the approved client apps from Microsoft. So go click the checkbox. It's essentially, I'm going to go make them use Microsoft Outlook for their email, or Microsoft List, Launch. Pretty much all the Microsoft apps are in here. Um, I don't think there's any third party apps in here. But the managed browser, I'm pretty sure, or maybe it's just Edge now. They used to have a specific managed browser. But you can force them to use those approved apps. You can enforce certain app protection policies. So this is going to be those app policies you may put in place. You're going to grant access, but you're going to require them to do a password change. So this one may seem odd, but if you're doing some of those risk-based policies, I have a user coming from this location. They're flagged with a risky sign-in that's high risk. I'm going to grant them access even though they're flagged as high risk, but I want to force them to change that password when they go in and access it because they've been flagged as high risk. Uh,
Mhm.
and then here, you can't do a granular and or, but you can do require everything you've configured up here or just require one of the selected controls. So maybe you require MFA or you require them to be hybrid joined. That's going to be, this is your or, this is your and for those checkboxes. So then once you've granted access, you can go in and control, okay, the session a little bit more as well. So this one, there are, man, Scott, did you break
Nodes.
Azure? Oh, there we go. Uh,
Wasn't my job to keep it running today, Ben.
oh, okay. App enforced restrictions. This is another one that is underused, in my opinion, but is really handy. You'll see it does not allow me to select it because it only applies to Office 365, Exchange, and SharePoint. So when I go up here and select my cloud apps, I have to go in and actually force this to something like SharePoint or Office 365 since that one popped up first. And then if I go back, cancel, close.
Gotta hit select.
Oh, I missed it. It was behind something in front of me. My button was hiding. Thanks. So it happens when there's stuff between me and my screen. Select session. Now I can go use app enforced restrictions. This varies from app to app. So for instance, SharePoint, if you use app enforced restrictions, this prevents downloading anything out of SharePoint. Files, documents, all of those, if you're going to apply app enforced restrictions, you have to do everything in the browser. Edit your documents, change your documents, work with your lists. You're not going to be able to sync. You're not going to be able to open it in the desktop application. It is browser only access to SharePoint. Uh, Outlook is the same type of thing. You're not going to be able to download emails. You're not going to be able to save attachments. You're going to be able to save attachments to OneDrive, but not to your desktop. And it actually disables all of those controls within those environments if you have app enforced restrictions on for SharePoint and for Exchange. When it comes to Office 365, this has to do with the new not persistent browser timeouts. You can set a global timeout, and I should go. I have the documentation here. Was this? Nope. That was session controls. App enforced restrictions. It talks about Exchange and SharePoint in here, where it gets into this persistent browser session. It's not even that one. Where was it? The documentation isn't great yet on app enforced restrictions for Office 365. Maybe it wasn't even in here. Yeah, it's not in here. It's in the blog post. We can post it in the show notes. But there is a new feature that lets you set a global idle session timeout across all of Office 365. If you're idle for 30 minutes, go ahead and sign out from any of your sessions in your browser. If you use app enforced restrictions, it actually does the opposite. It negates that tenant wide idle session timeout. So if your idle session timeout is 60 minutes and you go apply app enforced restrictions to domain joined devices for Office 365, it won't perform an idle session timeout after 60 minutes on those domain joined devices. Again, not very well documented. It's only in the blog post when they announced the idle session timeout that I found. Yeah, it was. Ooh, this is a different one too. Conditional.
It kind of makes sense though, because your token timeout, your SAML token from Azure AD, like it's kind of like a first one to set it win scenario almost.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I have no idea what this one is. Conditional access custom policies. So this is cloud app security.
I
Somebody
bet
needs to go
that's
up to.
I bet that's a session policy. in Microsoft Defender Cloud Apps.
Yes. We're gonna skip over this one. This ties into Microsoft Defender. We're gonna have to do another one on that. Um, but you can also do block downloads, self-onboarded for any app. Yeah, this one ties into that conditional access app control in Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. Sign-in frequency, you can enforce a re-authentication after a set amount of time, hours or days. So once a day, I want to require users in this condition to re-sign in, revalidate credentials. Persistent browser session, I've had a client use this too, particularly if you have shared workstations and you want, see, now I have my cloud app selected. Persistent browser session, you can set to never persist sessions. So if you have a shared workstation, you want people to uh, close their browser and have to re-authenticate when it opens again, you can go set persistent browser sessions to
Yep.
not persist that session. Continuous access evaluation, this is just to disable. This is on by default. We did a podcast, I think, on conditional or continuous access evaluation. But it helps with tokens, lifetimes, immediately blocking access to applications when, say, an account gets disabled. And then resiliency defaults. This one's kind of interesting, Scott. During an outage, if Azure AD can extend access to existing sessions, it's like they've had outages before and people wanted a way to make sure that their session stayed active.
Yes, yeah,
Um,
does happen. I think we talked about that a bunch on the podcast too, just as resiliency is improving in Azure AD and the march away from RDFE continues. Hopefully the need for some of those things disappears.
Yeah. So this just disables having some of that extra resiliency on there in the case of an outage. If you do want to make sure sessions expire or access is denied as soon as a session expires in the case of an outage.
Yeah,
This is probably a
I
rare
was
one.
like
This
the
is not one
people.
I've used.
I always like the people who complain about Azure AD outages when it goes down way less than all the other things that you've federated to. So, like, if you're a customer who's using ADFS, I guarantee you've had more outages on your ADFS servers than Microsoft has
Than
had with
Azure
Azure
AD
AD.
has.
And
Yeah.
because you federated to ADFS, guess what? That was part of your authentication workflow. So, good on you.
Yep. Good time. So that's everything. Once you have all of those set up, so
You
who
just
it's
click create.
assigned to, yep, click create. I'm not going to click create because I don't have much set up in this one. But once you create, again, probably leave it in report only for now. If you do want it on, make sure you have that exclusion in there. I'm just going to go close it and it will show up then in your list. That didn't work like I thought. In your list of conditional access policies. Um, and you can see mine on or off. Some of these, SharePoint, you can actually go set certain settings in SharePoint that do create conditional access policies. Over here, this is that actually app enforced restrictions. So there's an area in the SharePoint Admin Center. You can go block downloads. It just creates this conditional access policy. But one last thing, the what if. Scott mentioned this earlier. You've created all these policies. Maybe people are getting access denied or it's not behaving the way you thought it would. This what if is super handy. This allows you to go in and see what happens with a certain user. So I'm going to go pick my user and you set some type of condition. I'm this user, I'm accessing any of my cloud apps. You'll recognize all of this right from when we set it up. If you want to set an IP address, you want to set your corporate IP address, or you want to set one of those countries, um, go pick what country, the device platform. Say I'm coming from Mac OS. I'm going to come from my browser. Device state, we're not going to set that. I don't have a sign-in risk, service principal risk. I don't have properties for those devices. So, what scenario are you trying to figure out what's going on in your environment? And then you hit what if, it'll go through and evaluate it. So, you will see I have a MFA policy that applies to me. Um, I have that
Well,
idle
but
session
it's very
timeout
specific. What applies to you under that set of
right
conditions?
under this
So in
set of
that case, you said,
conditions.
like, what applies to me for all cloud apps? So or any cloud app, you could also constrain that and say what happens to be in SharePoint or what
Right.
happens to be in Exchange.
Yep. I could go in here and if it loaded my apps, is there an outage right now, Scott? What's going on with Azure?
It's
Uh,
all green check marks across the board. It's just your machine.
there we go. So I can do this
Is
here.
is your
I'll give you
Raspberry
an
Pi
example.
downloading too many radar images again? Like,
Maybe. Here we go. SharePoint Online. There. Since you brought it up, we'll go apply this to a specific application. Do a what if here. So now I want to access SharePoint. End user protection is still going to apply. It's going to force me to MFA. Um, so there's a couple of them. I also have a one for require MFA for admins. So that one also applies, forcing me to MFA. Idle session timeout. That one applies to everybody. So these apply. It also tells you though policies that won't apply, and it gives you why. SharePoint, it's off. So policy not enabled. Block legacy authentication, I'm not coming from a client app, so that one doesn't apply. Few policies here that aren't enabled require MFA for Azure management. Um, this one is not applying because I'm going to SharePoint and not to the Azure management app. So it's based on the app I'm going to. This one doesn't apply. US sign in doesn't apply due to the users and groups that's applied to.
yeah,
So
so
this,
why don't we do this? Like,
okay,
this is probably a good place to kinda close out, but let's close out with, execution order, or I guess rule precedence. And, in this case, you have a tenant with, let's call it 15 policies. 3
yep.
of those policies apply. So even though 3 apply, which ones get evaluated and when would evaluation stop?
I can't remember. Do you have the
Uh
documentation? Is it in here?
I was gonna say, keep me honest here, but what I recall of it is the most restrictive policy wins. So if you
Right,
have a policy that says like, "Hey, don't require MFA," and that policy's done, it's not gonna say like, "Okay, don't go check the rest of the policies," kind of thing.
right. And I guess from that perspective, I was trying to think. You caught me off guard with the wording. I was like, does it ever stop? I had to think. Um, but yes, to your point, it is not going to just evaluate one and stop. It looks at all of them and it does apply that most restrictive. Um, from that perspective, that is how it's going to work. It's going to look at all of them, apply all of them. You're going to get restricted the most it possibly can. It is not going to be a least restrictive or stop at any point in time. Um, I don't know. I was just looking. What is conditional access? I don't even know where it would be documented in here. Um,
Yeah.
but
I
yes,
didn't see it, but,
no, that was
probably
sorry. Yes,
mention it
that wording
briefly.
caught me off guard, but you are correct. That is how they all get evaluated.
It's just the old Microsoft test writer in me trying to confuse you.
Trying to confuse me, like make me think, what order are they applied in? There's no ranking. Those are Teams policies. That's a fun one we could play with too, Scott. Teams policies and how those get applied.
Yeah, well, uh, if you
Um,
wanna bang your head against the desk or the wall or the closest brick, yes,
yes.
absolutely. Alright, very cool. Why don't we go ahead and close this one down, and then maybe next time we talk M365, we can talk about the authentication context stuff, or context
Yes.
authentication, authentication
Context.
context, which would,
Authenticate. Yeah.
I either
Authentication
or both.
context. This one right
Yeah.
here.
Yep.
Authentication context. We also had some requests for DLP in Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. So we're racking up quite a list here, Scott. But if anybody else does have any questions, topics, anything they want to discuss, let us know. Post in the comments if you're one of our members on Discord. which you can find out more about through msclouditpro.com/membership. You can reach out to us there, give us some ideas. But thanks, Scott. That was fun. And we almost time
Yeah,
boxed ourselves to what we wanted to.
we're getting better.
We'll get better. We're just so long winded. We just like to talk. All right. Well, that's Scott. Go enjoy your day, enjoy your weekend, and we will actually talk to you soon to go record a podcast episode.
Great. Thanks, Ben.